Ever think about like what happens if, the president, like any president, is accused of something really serious? I mean, we're talking about potential crimes here, not just, policy disagreements. And they try to use their position to like get away with it. That's kind of the whole idea behind presidential immunity, right?
Yeah, and it gets really tricky really fast. Because on the one hand, you've got to protect the presidency as an institution. The president needs to be able to do their job without constantly worrying about getting sued or, dragged into court over every decision.
Right. You don't want a president who's afraid to act, because they're worried about legal repercussions. But at the same time, nobody is above the law, right?
Exactly. And that's the tightrope the courts have had to walk for centuries, trying to define the limits of presidential immunity. When does it apply? When does it not apply? It's a constant balancing act between protecting the office and upholding the rule of law.
And in this deep dive, we're dealing with a case that really pushes those boundaries. We're digging into a legal motion filed by special counsel Jack Smith, and let me tell you, it is a doozy. It argues against presidential immunity for the defendant, in a case stemming from the aftermath of the 2020 election.
This is the kind of case that keeps legal scholars up at night because it goes to the very heart of presidential power and accountability. We're talking about accusations of attempts to overturn the election, pressure campaigns on officials, and even potential incitement of the events of January 6th.
So, yeah, high stakes, to say the least. Before we get lost in the weeds, maybe give us a quick refresher on presidential immunity.
Sure thing. So the basic idea is that the president needs to be able to carry out their duties without the constant threat of legal action. I mean, imagine if every time a president made a decision, they had to worry about being sued by someone who disagreed with it.
Yeah, that would bring the government to a standstill.
Exactly. It would paralyze the executive branch. So that's why we have this concept of presidential immunity. It's rooted in the idea of separation of powers and the need for a strong and independent executive.
So it's like a protective bubble around the president?
Sort of, but it's not impenetrable. Like any good legal concept, it gets complicated.
Yeah, I was going to say, it can't be that simple.
It's not. The Supreme Court has actually drawn a distinction between what they call core official conduct and non-core conduct. For core official conduct, which is basically anything that falls squarely within the president's constitutional duties, the immunity is pretty much absolute. But for non-core conduct, things that are, more on the periphery of the president's official role, the immunity is much less certain.
Okay, so it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card after all.
Definitely not. And that's what makes this particular case so fascinating.
Because
the government is essentially arguing that a lot of the actions taken by the defendant in this case, well, they were taken not as president, but as a private citizen and a political candidate.
So they're trying to poke holes in that immunity shield by saying he wasn't even acting within his presidential role in the first place.
Precisely, they're saying that many of his actions, especially those related to the 2020 election, were outside the bounds of legitimate presidential action.
Wow, and they're basing this on...
Well, they have a whole legal framework for this. They call it the content, form, and context test.
Catchy.
Basically, they're looking at what he did, how he did it, and the circumstances surrounding his actions to determine whether they were truly official acts of a president or something else entirely.
So it's not just about what he did, but also why he did it and how he went about doing it.
Exactly. Context is key here.
And this is where things get really interesting, right?
Absolutely.
Because even if some of the actions were considered official, the motion suggests that the government still thinks they have a strong case.
That's right. This is where we get into the really tricky legal territory of rebutting presidential immunity.
Okay, so walk us through that, because I have a feeling this is going to get complicated.
It is, but I'll try to keep it simple. Basically, rebutting presidential immunity is a two-step process. First, the court has to decide if the conduct was official. If it was, then the next question is, are there extraordinary circumstances that justify overriding the presumption of immunity?
So they have to clear that first hurdle of official conduct, and then even if they do, there's a whole other hurdle waiting for them.
Exactly. And the government is arguing that this case presents those extraordinary circumstances.
That this is not just business as usual.
Right. They're saying that allowing prosecution in this instance wouldn't damage the presidency or prevent future presidents from doing their jobs.
So they're trying to strike a very delicate balance here.
They are. And whether they succeed will depend on how persuasive their arguments are and ultimately how the court interprets the law.
Well, let's dig into those arguments because they're fascinating and more than a little concerning.
Let's do it.
Okay, so they're trying to convince the court that this is not just some slippery slope argument, that this isn't going to open the floodgates to a million lawsuits against future presidents.
Exactly. They're walking a tightrope here trying to hold this particular president accountable without, creating a precedent that could hamstring future administrations.
So how do they do that? What kind of bar are we talking about here?
Well, they have to basically prove that prosecuting in this case wouldn't create what's called a chilling effect on future presidents.
A chilling effect, meaning?
Meaning it wouldn't make future presidents afraid to do their jobs.
Oh, okay. I see. So it wouldn't scare them into inaction.
Right. It wouldn't make them so worried about getting sued that they wouldn't make the tough calls.
They're essentially trying to prove that this case is the exception, not the rule.
Exactly. And to do that, they delve into the specifics of the defendant's actions.
Because I imagine they can't just say, trust us, this is different. They have to show the court why this case is so exceptional.
Right. They have to lay out a compelling narrative that goes beyond just legal arguments.
And they do that by?
By meticulously connecting specific actions to the defendant's personal and political goals. For example, they highlight how much he focused on overturning the results in states that he lost.
Right, he only cared about those specific states.
Exactly. And they point out that he only targeted officials from his own party. He didn't reach out to any election officials from the opposing party.
Interesting. So it's they're saying this wasn't about ensuring a fair election. It was about staying in power.
Precise. They're trying to show that his motives were purely self-serving.
And they back this up with
specific examples from the motion. They spend a lot of time on the defendant's claims about election fraud in Georgia.
Right. All those allegations about voting machines and, ballots being tampered with.
Exactly. They cite these claims and then point out that they were publicly or directly debunked.
So they're not just saying these claims were baseless. They're saying they were demonstrably false.
Right. They're building a case that this wasn't a matter of, good faith disagreements about the election. This was a deliberate attempt to spread misinformation and undermine the results.
And it's not just what he said, it's how he said it, right?
Exactly. The motion really emphasizes the language he used. The inflammatory rhetoric, the emotionally charged appeals, especially on Twitter.
Well, he did love his Twitter.
He did. And the government argues that he used it as a tool to sow doubt and distrust in the electoral system, to create a sense of chaos and confusion.
And speaking of Twitter, that Operation Pence card tweet is hard to ignore.
It's a key piece of evidence for them. They argue that the timing of that tweet, its content, and his awareness of how his supporters might react, all of that points towards a deliberate attempt to interfere with the peaceful transfer of power.
It's one thing to allege a pressure campaign. It's another thing to have it documented in real time on social media.
Exactly. And the motion draws those connections very explicitly.
And then there's the pressure campaign on state officials, like that phone call he made to the Georgia Secretary of State.
Right? That's a big one. They argue that this was a blatant attempt to influence the outcome of the election through extra-legal means.
And they back that up by
highlighting specific language used during the call, which they say constitutes a veiled threat.
So they're saying this wasn't just a concerned citizen expressing his opinion.
No, they're saying this was an abuse of power. And they emphasize the fact that he only challenged the results in states he lost. And he never reached out to any election officials from the opposing party.
So again, it all circles back to that idea of self-interest.
Right. The government is painting a picture of someone who used the power of the presidency for personal gain. And they're arguing that this blurring of lines, this fusion of personal interest and official action, is exactly why this case is different. It's why this extraordinary rebuttal of presidential immunity is warranted.
So they're basically saying that his behavior was so egregious, so outside the bounds of normal presidential conduct, that it justifies making an exception to the usual rules.
Exactly. They're asking the court to recognize the potential damage to our democracy.
The damage that could be done if this kind of behavior is allowed to go unchecked.
Exactly. They're saying that the stakes are simply too high to ignore this.
And they're putting their faith in the court's ability to see that.
They are. It's a bold strategy. But whether it works remains to be seen.
Well, this deep dive just took a very serious turn, but it's important stuff to talk about.
It is, and it raises a lot of questions that go beyond this particular case.
Like, where do we draw the line between legitimate political activity and something more sinister?
Exactly, and how do we hold our leaders accountable without undermining the institutions they represent?
It's a delicate balance, that's for sure.
It is, and one that we'll likely be grappling with for a long time to come.
When we talk about this whole idea of a president abusing their power, it's hard not to think about the pressure campaign on Vice President Pence. I mean, you've got the president of the United States leaning on his own VP to overturn the results of an election.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting from a legal perspective.
Because
You've got this situation where, on the one hand, the government acknowledges that conversations between a president and their vice president, about official duties, those are usually considered official conduct.
right, like that's all part of the job.
Exactly. But on the other hand, they're arguing that this specific pressure campaign, it targeted a process where the executive branch, by design, has no constitutional role.
You're talking about the certification of the election results.
Exactly. That's the key here.
So even though it was the president talking to his VP, the subject matter itself is what makes it so problematic.
Precisely. It's not like they were discussing, how to handle a foreign policy crisis.
Or how to implement a new law or something.
Right. This was about a process that was intentionally designed to be outside of presidential control.
And why is that?
Well, think about it. If a president could directly influence the certification of their own election.
That's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. The Founding Fathers were way ahead of us on this one. They were deeply wary of a sitting president abusing their power to influence the election of their successor.
Checks and balances, right.
Exactly. They wanted to make sure no single branch of government could control the whole election process.
And they were really adamant about keeping the executive branch out of it.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the motion actually quotes Alexander Hamilton on this point.
No way.
Yeah, in Federalist 68, he writes that excluding the executive branch from the election certification process would guard against the possibility of an improper combination between the president and the Electoral College.
Wow. Talk about foreshadowing, right?
Right. It's like they saw this coming centuries ago.
So the government is basically saying that this pressure campaign on Pence was the exact scenario Hamilton warned against?
Precisely, they're arguing that the defendant's actions were a direct threat to that carefully constructed separation of powers.
And that this wasn't just some abstract constitutional violation?
Right. They're also arguing that prosecuting this type of behavior wouldn't harm any legitimate executive functions.
So it's not like they're saying a president can never talk to their VP about an election.
Exactly. They're drawing a distinction between, routine conversations and what they see as a blatant attempt to subvert the Constitution.
So they're saying this is about drawing a line in the sand.
Right. And making it clear that certain actions are simply off limits. Even for a president.
And they back up this argument
with some pretty damning evidence.
Like what?
Well, for example, they point to his repeated insistence that Pence could unilaterally overturn the election results.
Even after being told by his own advisors that he couldn't.
Exactly. They also highlight that tweet attacking Pence.
The one that was sent as the Capitol riot was happening.
That's when they argue that the timing of that tweet and the fact that it was read aloud to the rioters shows a clear intent to incite violence.
It's chilling to think about.
It is, and it really underscores the seriousness of the allegations.
So where does this all leave us? We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have, and we've seen how the government is building a case.
Yeah.
That the defendant's actions went far beyond the bounds of acceptable presidential behavior.
They're saying that he used the power of his office, not to serve the country, but to serve his own interests.
And they're asking the court to hold them accountable for that.
And in doing so, to reaffirm those crucial boundaries of presidential power.
Because at the end of the day, no one, not even the president, is above the law.
Well said. That's a good note to end on. This case raises a lot of questions about the future of our democracy and how we balance the need for a strong executive with the need for accountability and the rule of law.
It's a conversation that we as a society need to have.
And I have a feeling it's a conversation that's going to continue for a long time to come. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been enlightening, to say the least.
It's always a pleasure to be here.